Hey everybody, Pete Meyer, Motor Age Magazine. Welcome once again to Shop Talk Live. Today, TPMS is the topic, and the expert that's going to help us figure it all out is Ms. Sheila Stevens. She is the marketing manager slash sales support and field trainer with ATEQ TPMS. Let's bring her on. Sheila, welcome to Shop Talk Live.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to come out and sit with us and help those who are watching understand TPMS a little bit better. It's not new, is it, Sheila? It's been around for quite a while.
That's right. It was mandated in 2007, so all vehicles manufactured in the US have a TPMS system in them since 2008. It's not a new technology, but to a lot of shops, now that the batteries and the sensors are starting to die, it's becoming a little bit more of a new technology that's a must-have in the shop.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point that you just made. We said at the beginning when these systems first started coming out that, yeah, these batteries are going to last 7, 8, 10 years. It'll be a while before we have to worry about them. But now it looked like that was yesterday. Now it's a symptom where these batteries, like you mentioned, are starting to fail. From your perspective, your company's perspective, do you have an idea of what kind of failure rate you're seeing? Are we seeing more and more sensors needing replacement?
It's a lot of the time, there's two different things. So you have batteries that are dying, which typically it's about 7 to 10 years or, so many miles. It could be quicker. Also, you're looking at getting vehicles in the shop, and sometimes the sensors break or they get corroded. The sensor could get corroded and damaged. And if that happens, you have to replace that sensor.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we've preached in the magazine quite a bit when we're talking about TPMS is the need to perform that check right when the customer arrives at the shop, right? See if there's a problem before you even bring it in, even if you're just performing something as simple as a flat repair. What do you guys tell techs?
We always make sure to tell technicians to check the information on the vehicle before you put it on the lift or whatnot. It's really easy to do. With a TPMS tool, you can activate each sensor and it'll show you the relevant information. So if you're not able to pick up a sensor, it could be, like I said, the battery could be dying or dead. It could be damaged or corroded. So if you can't pick up that information, you probably are going to need to replace that.
Now, I remember in the early days, of course, we had indirect systems that were just relying on the existing ABS components, essentially the wheel speed sensors, essentially to calculate that or see if there's a difference in circumference of the tire. Got rather involved trying to figure it out that
Yes.
way, right? And then we came with the direct sensors, and the early ones they weren't visible. You still had that rubber valve stem, but the sensor was actually banded around the inside of the tire. What kind of things do you tell technicians now to say? How do they determine whether or not there is an active sensor on that vehicle if there's no outward sign?
Well, there's a couple different things. So there are still indirect systems out there. So for example, Jettas are an indirect system. So if you are working with a tool, you're going to want to check to make sure what system you're working with. So like you had mentioned, indirect system, they work with the wheel speed and it communicates to the ABS system. So you're not going to be able to check that sensor information. With a direct system, a tool should be able to tell you whether it's an indirect system or if it's a direct system. So checking that information before you work on the vehicle is vital because typically the customers are not going to know whether they have a direct or
Sure.
indirect system.
Yeah, they just know they got this funny looking light on the dash that they don't know what it means, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then you had the banded sensors as well. A lot of companies went away from that. So when you do replace them, you can replace it with the new sensors as well.
Really? So you're
Yes,
saying that some of the
absolutely.
vehicles that were using the banded sensors now, you could replace them with one of the metal stem or rubber stem style sensors?
Yes, absolutely. A
Oh.
lot of companies got away from using the banded sensors um, because when you were measuring the system, it didn't matter if the valve stem was near the banded sensor or not. So it's kind of hard to find it around the tire. And also the banded ends typically broke kind of easily. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the first systems that was used, especially by Fords. So now when you replace it, you can actually replace it with one of these.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So now, do the sensors that you replace, whether it's to replace the banded sensor or to replace one that's damaged or the battery's failed, do you have to have the exact sensor to replace that with?
Well, you can. So you can use an OE sensor. You can use a tool typically to look up the part number. But the aftermarket sensor technology has gotten very, very advanced. So in the beginning, you had a few options for aftermarket sensor coverage. Now you have a lot of different sensor companies that you can use their sensors to replace them with. So when you're working with TPMS and you have a tool, you're going to want to look up that make, model, and year and see which sensor companies do support that particular vehicle. And then you can write IDs or clone IDs to that aftermarket sensor.
And what's the difference between those two terms?
So creating a new ID is if, for example, I have one here. So this was actually from my mother-in-law's vehicle. She has a 2008 Camry. And I don't know if you can see very well, but the sensor battery broke and there was some corrosion here. And this is a clamp-in sensor. So when she went in, obviously it wasn't working. We couldn't even pick up the information. So what we did is we had to create a new ID because there was a broken sensor there and the battery was dead. So that's the difference between creating a sensor. Now, if you could read this information here, and it was just a matter of these sensors are getting old, if one needs to be replaced, it was a 2008 vehicle, most likely all of them will need to be replaced. So you're going to want to clone or copy that sensor information, and that way you don't have to create a new ID. So cloning that sensor information can sometimes help if you want to bypass a TPMS reset.
Okay, so in other words, if I'm a shop owner or technician working in a shop, and I notice that I'll just say we're putting new tires on the vehicle, and I check the sensors beforehand, and I see that, oh well, this one's indicating a low battery, or this one's damaged, and so I should replace them as a set then, huh? If it's a battery issue.
It depends. If you're working with OE sensors and you have an older vehicle, typically if one sensor goes, all of them are going to go. And so we always recommend, we always tell the technicians to recommend to replace all of them, because most likely in the next month or so, you're going to have that customer coming back to the shop with the light on and frustrated because they just spent money to replace that sensor.
Okay, so continuing on that same scenario, if I'm replacing the sensors and I can get it to talk to my tool, then I can, for lack of a better word, like we talk about with programming, I can actually inhale that data from that sensor, right? And then I can take the new one, which is a blank slate, and just exhale that to the new sensor. And I've just, as you use the term, I basically cloned the original sensor, so the vehicle's not going to know any difference. As far as it's concerned, it's going to say, well, it's the same one that was there 5 minutes ago.
Yes, exactly. And the manufacturers always recommend to do a relearn. We always recommend doing a relearn. Some vehicles have the technology that you can drive for so long and the sensors will recognize where they're located. But I have a good instance here. So my father actually went to a lube shop and then got his tires rotated. And the light went on for his left front tire. And he went and checked it and it was fine. It was at placard pressure. he went back to the shop and it was actually the back tire that was low. So that's why we always recommend doing a relearn, because depending on the vehicle, you need to make sure that the vehicle is recognizing exactly where those sensors are located, whether it's the left front, right right rear, or left rear.
Yeah, and I guess more and more vehicles are actually being more specific as to tire location. I remember in the old days, it was just your light came on and you knew it was one of the four, but so more and more they're telling you exactly which one it is, right? So if that's the case, then I'm just thinking that as a technician, even if I'm not doing new tires or a flat repair or anything like that, but just a simple process of rotating the tires, I need to make
Yeah,
sure, right?
absolutely. So there's two different systems with direct TPMS. So you have a low line system, and I actually have a 2009 Ford Fusion myself, and it has a low line system. So whenever one of my tires is low, it'll alert me. But if you have a newer vehicle with a highline system, you can actually see all the tire pressures in real time. And that will indicate that this tire is low or that tire is low by location. So that's why it's really important, you know, if you're getting your tires rotated, that they do send those IDs to the ECU so that the ECU will recognize exactly where those tire pressure sensors are located.
Gotcha. Now, kind of backing up a step, because we talked about the clone, but if there's something wrong with the sensors you shared, like with the one where the battery is dead and it was broken and it wasn't transmitting anything, then you you can assign that. You can create an ID for that, but then you have to tell the car, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how
So
does that work?
So you have to use a tool. We have several different options for TPMS tools. So I have a few here. So you have a VT56, and then you have other options like a VT36. So anyways, so if you go into the vehicle, select your make, model, and year, select the brand of sensor that you're working with, then you can actually create new IDs to that sensor instead of cloning them.
And if I remember, and you can tell me if it's changed since then, but some time ago we actually did a webinar on TPMS service, and we were looking at, like as you were saying, the relearn process. Then it looked like most of the domestics had a way of, like you said, driving the vehicle. I've actually just put it in learn mode and activated the sensors with a tool so that the vehicle would register them. But the Asians and some of the Euros, they were a little more involved. You actually had to plug in and to the DLC. Is
Yes.
that still holding true?
Yes. So with different reset procedures, they're called relearns. You have a few different options. So I'll go over the indirect system first. So even though there's no sensors in the wheel, you still have to recalibrate that system. So in the tools, you do have a set of procedures written in there because you have to, like I said, recalibrate that system.
So
Then,
there's a guide built into the tool to help that tech get through for that specific model.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. Which is really nice because they don't have to break out the owner's manual or get the big book with all the relearns in it.
Right.
It's
Right.
just all in the tool here.
Right. So anyway, I'll let you go back to what you were saying there.
So no, you're fine. Interrupt me anytime. So also you have three different direct relearn systems. You have auto relearn, where you act, like you said, you activate each sensor and then you have to drive for a certain period of time. Um, and then you have a manual, or sometimes called stationary TPMS relearn, where you have a certain series of steps that you have to perform, and they are set by the manufacturer. And you have to perform those steps in order to put your vehicle into learn mode. And then once you activate those sensors, that will then send that information to the ECU. Then you have the last one here. Oops, sorry about that. Um, where you're using the OBD module. It looks like this.
Okay.
And this is the device that you would use with the tool to act. So you would use the tool to activate each sensor. and then you would plug this into the tool, and then you'd plug it into the DLC. So this is for Asian vehicles. But one thing that ATEQ came out with is a new patented technology that will allow you to do it with domestics too. So now your technicians don't have to remember all the relearn steps, which there's a lot of different systems. So it can be hard to remember everything. So it's really nice that we have this technology now.
You just follow the prompts on the tool.
Exactly. And so we're working on one relearn for all vehicles. So especially with, I don't know if you've ever worked with Fords, where GMC's is a good example too, where you have to do about 12 different steps in order to put that vehicle into relearn mode. Mm-hmm. So if you're using an ATEQ tool or a powered by ATEQ tool, and when you go into service, select your make, model, and year, if you see an OBD relearn as an option, that's our bonus OBD relearn coverage, and you'll be able to do just an OBD relearn.
Oh, very good. Very good. Something else I want to touch on, because I don't think a lot of guys think about it when they're working in the field. You know, again, you're doing a wheel service of some kind, whether you're changing the tire, fixing the flat, whatever. Maybe you're replacing a damaged sensor. It's really not just a matter of just throwing it in there, is there? Especially with the metal sensors, there are some things you have to make sure you do to avoid damaging the replacement, right? So, is there some highlights you can share with us that of what to make sure you're looking at when you're actually servicing the sensor assembly itself?
Yeah, so absolutely. So you have two different kinds of sensors here. So, and I have a couple here. Let me just get them out. Okay, so this is a snap-in sensor, and it's going to have a rubber valve. So a lot of the domestic vehicles will be manufactured with snap-in sensors. And then you also have the clamp-in sensor option as well. So a lot of European vehicles will be manufactured with clamp-in sensors. So with a clamp-in sensor, you're going to need to use like a torque tool to basically get it to the right torque and everything and to assemble it correctly. So I have a sensor here, and essentially you're just putting this together, but you have to make sure it's set at the right torque. And when you get the sensor, it'll give you all of the correct information on what torque size tool that you're going to need. And then with snap-in sensors, no matter what you do with this valve, you're going to it's going to break when you take it out. So it's important to have a valve puller to be able to take out that sensor, and you're always going to have to replace the valve on the sensor. Mm-hmm. It's just important to be careful with the actual sensor when you're pulling that out of the wheel.
Yeah, and that's not I mean, it may look like a traditional old rubber valve stem, but it's not, right? I mean, it's like, you know, you have to, I know one thing that, and you can tell me if this is still true or not, when these sensors first came out, you had to make sure you used, even if you boogered up the Schrader valve, you had to use the right Schrader valve in there. You couldn't just grab one out of that rubber stem that you might have had laying in the bin at the shop. You actually had to use the right one because of the material, right? The metal would if it's mismatched, it would lead to corrosion, if I remember.
Yes, absolutely. It's really, really important. In our tools, we do have a part number lookup so that you can see which surface kit would work best with the actual sensor that you're working with. And if you mix metals, like you said, yeah, that will definitely lead to corrosion. So having the right tools to be able to service the sensor, and then also having the right materials is very, very important.
Now, one more question I have for you. This is more on the service side of things. You know, customers, they don't like to spend any more than they have to. So they have that little light on, and if it's not related to a low tire, a flat tire, I guess first I should ask, when the technician is or the service writer is looking at the light on the dash, how do they know whether it's indicating a low tire or it's indicating a problem with the TPMS system itself?
So when your light is flashing, and if it flashes for a while before it becomes solid, that means there is a TPMS mill. And if it's solid, if it's just a solid light, that just indicates low tire pressure. So what I would recommend to a technician is to turn on the vehicle and see whether the light is flashing or solid. Once they indicate that, then check each sensor and see if we're not able to read a sensor, then there's an issue there. If you're checking it in the it's below placard pressure, then you can just educate the customer on, hey, this is the correct pressure that your tire is supposed to be at, and just make sure to educate them on that.
Yeah, and how do you sell the customer on the need to maintain the TPMS system, period?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is, like I mentioned before with snap-in sensors, this valve will have to be replaced if they're getting a new wheel. For example, when you do the valve pull, you're going to break this part of it. And it's not entirely expensive, but that's why it's important for the technicians to have at least the best practices in replacing TPMS, so they are not damaging that sensor, because that will then be a little bit more expensive.
Sure. And same with even on the steel stems, the metal stems, replacing the seals, making sure you tighten it to the right torque to seat it. It's very, we're all heavy-handed in the shop. It's really easy to over tighten that, but if you do, again, you're going to be damaging. You could damage the electronics in that sensor, and now you have an expensive comeback.
Exactly. And when you replace, like I said, when you replace a snap-in sensor, it will break immediately, but we always recommend to replace this part as well. So it's not as pricey if you are just taking it apart with the correct tools and not damaging the sensor.
Right.
Replacing this is a lot more cost efficient.
Right. And guys, for everyone who's watching, if your customer talks and complains about his TPMS sensor, let them know that this was put in place as a safety measure after a rather serious issue with Ford and Firestone many years ago. Right? It was called it was called the TREAD Act, the Tire Recall and something Act that Congress passed, and made TPMS a mandatory safety system on the car. So it's important as the ABS system. It's as important as the airbag system. It's an important safety system that you should encourage your customer to maintain.
Absolutely. It's definitely a big liability if you let your customer leave with a TPMS light on. And I believe it's in California, there's actually a law that just got put into place that you can't let your customer leave with the light on, and then you have to keep records for at least 7 years.
Wow.
And if you replace that sensor or whatever tire pressure sensor work you have done on their vehicle.
Wow, so, I did not know that. That's something.
Yeah, I could definitely send you over information about that too.
So we can do that. We'll get that out to our readers. Hey, Sheila, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. We sure learned a lot. I'm sure there's a lot more to learn. So if anyone who's watching wants to find out more information about TPMS or ATEQ's TPMS solutions, where should they go?
You can go to our website at atec-tpms.com. We're very, very active on social media as well. So definitely check us out on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter.
Yeah, see that? And you can go see Sheila show you how to do this stuff live and in person on the YouTube channel. And of course, they're also very active at various events around the country. What are some of the ones that you guys are going to be participating in over the next few months?
We have a lot of customer shows coming up. With the next one we actually have coming up is with Myers Tire Supply. So it's their supplier fair show. And then we're always at SEMA and Apex as well every year.
Absolutely. All right. Well, again, Sheila, thank you so much. And everyone who's watching, thank you so much for hanging out with us today on Shop Talk Live. We'll see you in 2 weeks for our next episode. Until then, Pete Meyer of Motor Mage Magazine. Have a great day.
Thank you.